The curse was a thing of stillness. It was the frost that never left the window panes, the perpetual twilight that bled the color from the world, and the silence that had long ago swallowed the king. In the valley below the onyx spire, the people called it the king's gloom, a blight that had settled over the land 5 centuries before, choking the sun from the sky and locking the earth in a winter that never broke. They had forgotten the feeling of true warmth, the sight of a blue sky. Their hope had become a brittle, frozen thing. But in a small cottage at the edge of the village of Stillwater, hope was still tended like a stubborn ember. Ilara was a lantern maker, a craft inherited from a grandmother who had told stories of the sun as if it were a lost god. Her hands, nimble and calloused, knew the language of paper and wire and wick. In a world of greys and deep blues, she coaxed light from oil and wax, small, defiant stars against an oppressive dark. The gloom was a physical weight, a pressure on the chest, but inside her workshop, with the scent of melted beeswax and drying ink, the air felt a fraction lighter. This year, the cold was deeper, more malicious. It had crept through the chinks in their cottage and settled in the chest of her younger brother, Finn. His cough was a thin, rattling sound that echoed the skeletal branches of the trees outside. The village physician had shaken his head, his words lost in a puff of white breath. "It's the damp and the dark," he'd murmured, his gaze distant. "What he needs is sunlight." A proper summer, a bitter laugh had caught in Ilara's throat. A summer was a fairy tale. For 6 days now, Finn had barely woken, his breath a shallow flag of surrender. Ilara had watched him, her own breathing seeming to slow in sympathy, her heart a cold, hard knot. The lanterns she lit around his bed felt like a mockery, their gentle glow unable to penetrate the profound chill in his small body. Desperation was a sharp, metallic taste in her mouth. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Stories of the vampire king in his spire, the architect of their suffering, a creature of shadow and ice who had not been seen by mortal eyes in generations. They said he was immortal, unfeeling, a monster carved from the very winter he commanded. But the stories also whispered of a bargain. Once, long ago, a desperate soul had climbed the winding path to the onyx spire and offered a trade. The legends were vague on the details, but the core of the tale remained: the king could be bartered with, if one had something of value. And Ilara, with Finn's life fraying like an old thread, had nothing left to lose. What she had was a skill. A belief, however foolish, in the power of light. The decision settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, solemn click, like a lock finding its key. She packed a satchel with her finest tools, silver wire thin as spider silk, sheets of pressed paper infused with dried winterrose, a dozen of her best candles, their wicks trimmed and ready. She kissed Finn's pale forehead, the skin shockingly cold, and whispered a promise into the still air. "I will bring the sun back for you." The journey to the spire was a pilgrimage through a dead world. The snow under her boots was old and compacted, layered like geologic strata of failed seasons. The trees were black skeletons against a bruised purple sky where a pale, disinterested moon hung. Silence was the true ruler of this land. It was in the muffled crunch of her footsteps, in the absence of birdsong, in the way the air itself seemed to refuse to move. As she climbed higher, the village lights vanished, and she was utterly alone, a single, warm-blooded creature in a kingdom of ice. The onyx spire did not loom, it pierced. It was a shard of obsidian thrust into the heavens, a structure that seemed to drink what little light existed in the world. The gates were immense, wrought iron twisted into patterns of thorns and sleeping predators, coated in a layer of frost that glittered like diamond dust. They were closed. There was no bell, no knocker, only the profound, intimidating finality of the entrance. She felt a tremor of fear, a primal urge to turn back, to return to the familiar cold of her home. But then the image of Finn's face, pale and still, rose in her mind, and it became an anchor. Taking a deep breath that stung her lungs, she reached into her satchel and pulled out her smallest, most perfect lantern. It was a simple sphere of rose-tinted paper, with a single, steady flame inside. She hung it on one of the frozen iron thorns of the gate. It was a tiny, ridiculous gesture. A single candle against a mountain of night. She waited. The wind whispered around the battlements, a lonely, mournful sound. The silence stretched, becoming a presence in itself. She began to think it was hopeless, that the king was a myth, or simply dead, or so lost in his own despair that the world outside had ceased to exist for him. She was about to turn away when a sound broke the stillness. It was not a thunderous groan of gears, but a soft, metallic sigh, like an ancient creature stirring from a long sleep. The great gate swung inward, not a crack, but a wide, silent invitation into the darkness beyond. The king was waiting. The air inside the gate was not just cold, it was ancient. It was the chill of a tomb, heavy with the scent of dust, stone, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that spoke of shed blood and profound loneliness. The great hall was a cavern of shadows, its scale designed for giants or gods, not for a mortal woman of 5.5 feet. Arches soared into a darkness so complete it felt solid, and the floor was a polished black marble that reflected the faint light from her satchel like a still, frozen lake. The only illumination came from high, slitted windows that showed the same bruised twilight as the world outside. The silence here was different, too. It was not empty, but expectant, a held breath. She walked forward, her footsteps echoing in the immensity of the space. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the cathedral of quiet. She felt, more than saw, a presence on the dais at the far end of the hall. A throne, carved from a single piece of obsidian, rose like a jagged tooth from the platform. And on it, someone sat. He did not move as she approached. He was a figure of long lines and sharp angles, draped in fabrics so dark they seemed woven from the shadows themselves. As she drew closer, details emerged from the gloom: pale, elegant hands resting on the arms of the throne, a fall of hair as black as a raven's wing, and a face that was both beautiful and terrible. It was a face from a forgotten age, all high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was utterly devoid of warmth, of life. It was a mask of perfect, remote control. His eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers, were the color of a winter sky just before the snow, a flat, depthless gray. There was no malice in them. There was nothing at all. "You bring fire into my house," he said. His voice was not a monstrous growl, but a low, cultured baritone, smooth as polished stone and just as cold. It didn't echo, the hall seemed to absorb the sound instantly. Ilara's own voice felt small, a fragile thing. "I bring light, Your Majesty," she curtsied, a clumsy, trembling gesture. He inclined his head, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible. "A meaningless distinction. Both are temporary. Both will be consumed by the dark. But for a time," she insisted, finding a sliver of courage, "they hold the dark at bay." A flicker of something, not interest, perhaps curiosity, the way a scientist might observe a strange insect, passed through his gray eyes. "Why are you here, little lantern maker? The path to this place is not for the idle. The world has long since learned to leave me to my solitude." Here it was. The moment of the bargain. She swallowed, her throat dry. "My brother is dying. The cold you command has taken root in him. The people of the valley, they forget what it is to hope. They live in your gloom and they are fading." "A tragedy," the king said, his tone utterly flat, devoid of sympathy. "The world is full of them. What has it to do with me?" "You are the king," she said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "This is your kingdom. Its suffering is yours." For the first time, a genuine, albeit faint, emotion touched his features, a cold, bitter amusement. "You think I command this? This endless twilight? This suffocating frost? Child, I do not command the curse. I am the curse. It is in my blood, in my bones. The winter in your valley is but a pale reflection of the one that resides in here." He tapped a long, white finger against his own chest. The confession hung in the air, more chilling than the cold itself. He wasn't a tyrant willingly plunging his kingdom into darkness. He was a prisoner on a throne. This changed everything, and yet, nothing. "Then let me help you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. His hollow amusement returned. "And how would you do that? With your paper and your string?" "With this," she said, her resolve hardening. She reached into her satchel and drew out another lantern, this one shaped like a 6-point star. She lit it with a practiced, steady hand. A warm, golden light bloomed in the oppressive dark, pushing the shadows back a few feet. It was a small victory, but a real one. The winter solstice is in 3 weeks. It is the longest night of the year, the day the dark is strongest. They say that what happens on the solstice sets the tone for the year to come. Let me stay until then. Let me fill this place, your home, with light. Not just the light of flame, but the light of life. Of warmth. Of spirit. He watched the flame dance in the star-shaped lantern, his face unreadable. And what do you ask in return for this performance? If I can bring a single moment of genuine warmth into this castle, into your heart, then you will break the winter. You will pull back the gloom from my valley for 1 full day. Just 1. Enough for the sun to touch the earth. Enough to give us a chance. It was an audacious, impossible request. She expected him to laugh, to dismiss her, to have her thrown out into the frozen wastes. Instead, he was silent for a long, drawn-out moment. He seemed to be looking not at her, but through her, at a past she could not imagine. 1 moment of warmth, he repeated, the words tasting strange in his own mouth. He could not remember the sensation. Warmth was an abstraction, a word from a dead language. He had seen her tiny light on his gate, a pinprick of defiant orange in his world of monochrome grey. It had not warmed him, but it had registered. It was a deviation in the endless, flat line of his existence. What harm could there be in allowing the insect to perform its strange, futile dance? Very well, King Valerus said, the words sealing her fate. You may stay until the solstice. Fill my halls with your fleeting little lights. But know this castle has a cold that swallows all flames. And my heart, he paused, his grey eyes finding hers again, holding them with an unnerving intensity. My heart is a colder thing still. You will fail. And when you do, you will leave, and the silence will return. And if I succeed, she whispered. Then your village will have its day of sun, he said, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was a smile that held no joy, only the certainty of her defeat. And I will have witnessed a miracle. The days that followed were a battle against an unseen, unrelenting enemy. The castle itself seemed to fight her. The cold was an active presence, seeping from the stone walls, clinging to the tapestries, and devouring the warmth from her lanterns almost as soon as they were lit. A flame that should have lasted for hours would gutter and die in minutes. The air was thick with a despair so ancient it had become part of the mortar. It was a place that had forgotten how to be alive. Ilara chose a small section of the vast library to begin her work. It was less intimidating than the great hall, and the presence of books, even books covered in a fine layer of dust, felt like a comfort. She swept the floors, her broom whispering across the marble, the sound a small rebellion against the profound silence. She polished the long refectory tables until the dark wood gleamed faintly. She hung her lanterns from the iron chandeliers, dozens of them, in shades of saffron and rose and pale gold. When she was done, she stepped back to admire her work. The corner of the library was transformed. It was an island of warm, gentle light in an ocean of darkness. The glow illuminated the spines of leather-bound books, revealing titles in a script she couldn't read. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt hopeful. Instead, the effect was deeply unsettling. The light didn't fill the space, it was contained by the shadows, which seemed to press in from all sides, patient and predatory. The warmth from the dozens of candles barely reached 5 feet before being utterly consumed. To stand outside the circle of light was to feel a cold so profound it felt like a physical blow. Valerus would watch her sometimes. He moved with a preternatural grace, appearing in a doorway without a sound, a column of darkness observing her frantic, futile efforts. He never spoke, never offered a word of encouragement or scorn. He simply observed, his grey eyes flat and unreadable. His presence was a constant reminder of the impossibility of her task. He was the embodiment of the castle's cold, the source of its despair. How could she warm a place when its master was a black hole of warmth? One evening, exhausted and disheartened, she found her hands trembling so much she could barely light a fresh wick. The failure was a physical weight on her shoulders. She had been here for a week, and all she had managed to do was burn through 1/3 of her candles for no discernible effect. The castle remained as cold and silent as the day she arrived. Finn's face swam in her vision, and a sob caught in her throat. She sank onto a dusty window seat, pulling her cloak tightly around herself, and looked out at the perpetual twilight. The landscape was unchanging, a vista of jagged black peaks and frozen forests under a sky the color of an old bruise. There was no sunrise, no sunset, no passage of time marked by the sky. There was only the endless, monotonous grey. For the first time, she felt a sliver of understanding for the king. To exist in this unchanging nothingness for centuries, it wasn't a life. It was a sentence. He was there, of course. Leaning against a bookshelf in the deepest shadows, he was almost invisible. "Your lights are failing," he stated. It was not a taunt, merely a fact. "The cold is hungry," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I told you it was." She turned to face him, a surge of frustration cutting through her despair. "Why? Why is it like this? What is this curse?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the landscape outside the window. "It was a gift, once," he said, his voice a low murmur. "From a sorceress I spurned. She promised me a kingdom that would reflect my heart. At the time, I was arrogant. Vain. I thought she meant it would be a place of power and beauty. I did not understand she saw the coldness already taking root inside me. She gave me what she promised. A world without warmth. Without color. Without change. An eternal monument to my own emptiness." His confession was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone he used for everything, but the words themselves were a raw wound. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a man living inside his own tomb, a tomb built from a single, youthful mistake. "You see nothing but grey?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Grey," he confirmed. "And black. And the white of the snow. Your lanterns, they are merely brighter shades of grey to me. Little smudges of pale light. Futile." The word stung, but it also ignited something in her. Futility was the enemy she had been fighting her entire life. Her whole existence was a testament to the importance of small, defiant acts. "It is not futile to try," she said, her chin lifting. "The futility is in surrender." He actually looked at her then, a direct, piercing gaze. "You have a fire inside you, lantern maker. I can see it. A faint, grey flickering, but a fire nonetheless. The castle has not yet extinguished it." He pushed himself away from the bookshelf and glided towards the circle of her light. He stopped just at its edge, unwilling or unable to step into its glow. "It will." He vanished back into the shadows, leaving her alone with the dying flames and his chilling prophecy. But something had shifted. He had spoken to her, shared a piece of his own story. And in his bleak, grey world, he had seen a flicker of fire in her. It wasn't warmth, not yet. But it was a start. It was a crack in the ice, infinitesimally small, but there. She looked at her hands, no longer trembling. Her task was not to fight the castle's cold. Her task was to tend to the flicker of fire inside its king. The king's admission changed the nature of her work. She had been trying to wage war on the darkness, to conquer it with sheer volume of light. Now, she understood. The battle was not for the castle, it was for him. The cold was not in the stone, but in his soul. Her lanterns were not weapons, but invitations. She abandoned the grand, public spaces. The great hall, the soaring galleries, they were fortresses of his despair, too vast to breach. Instead, she sought out the smaller, more intimate corners of the onyx spire, the places where a memory of life might still linger, however faint. She discovered a small conservatory, its glass panes thick with frost. Inside, the skeletal remains of ancient plants stood in ornate pots, a garden frozen in time. With painstaking care, she cleaned the glass, polishing away centuries of grime until the grey twilight outside could filter through more clearly. She placed a single, warm-hued lantern in the center of the room, not to banish the cold, but to stand with the frozen plants, a silent, lonely vigil. Another day, she stumbled upon a music room. A harp stood shrouded in a dusty sheet, its strings long silent. A harpsichord, its keys yellowed like old teeth, sat against one wall. She didn't know how to play, but her grandmother had sung her songs of the sun, of green fields and summer festivals. Sitting on the cold bench, her breath pluming in the air, she began to sing one of the old songs. Her voice was clear and true, but it felt small in the vast, listening silence of the room. It felt like shouting into a void. She sang of the solstice, of the tradition of gathering together, of sharing food and stories to remind the sun to return. It was a song of community, of shared warmth against the longest night. As she sang the final verse, a quiet hymn of hope for the dawn, she felt that now familiar sensation of being watched. Valeru stood in the doorway, a figure of absolute stillness. She didn't know how long he had been there. He had not come to observe her work this time, he had been drawn by the sound. "What was that?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "A solstice carol," she said, her voice a little shaky. "From my village." He drifted into the room, his gaze falling on the silent instruments. "Music," he said, the word an artifact from a forgotten language. "I remember, there was music in this room." Before he reached out a long, pale finger and traced the line of the harp, careful not to touch the strings. Her hands, they would move across the strings. And there was sound. He was talking about the sorceress, she realized. The one who had cursed him. He was not remembering the anger or the betrayal, but the beauty that had come before it. A flicker of his life before the endless grey. What did it sound like? Ilara asked gently. He shook his head, a slow, frustrated movement. "I cannot recall the notes. I only remember the feeling." It was the opposite of this silence. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not emptiness in his eyes, but a vast, aching loss. "Your song." It was a small thing, but it was not silence. For a moment. This, she thought, this was the crack widening. It wasn't about the physical warmth of a flame. It was about filling the emptiness. It was about reminding him of what had been lost, not to torment him, but to suggest it might be found again. From then on, her efforts took a new direction. She still lit her lanterns, but they were now secondary. Her primary tools became story and scent and sound. She found the castle kitchens, a cavernous, cold space with hearths that had been dark for centuries. It took her an entire day to clean one of the smaller ovens and find wood dry enough to burn. The first curl of smoke, the first crackle of flame, felt like a monumental victory. She had no flour, no yeast, but she had brought a small bag of dried apples and spices from home. She baked them, filling the cold air with the scent of cinnamon and cloves. The aroma, so alien in this place of dust and stone, drifted through the castle corridors. It was a scent of home, of winter festivals, of life. She didn't know if Valerus noticed, but she felt the oppressive weight in the air lighten, just for a moment. She began to talk to him, not waiting for him to appear. As she worked, polishing a silver mirror or mending a frayed tapestry, she would speak of her life in the village. She told him about Finn, about his laugh and his love for drawing impossible monsters. She described the annual solstice market, the taste of roasted chestnuts, the feel of new-fallen snow before it turned to old, hard ice. She painted a world for him, full of color and sensation, a world that existed just down the mountain. He would listen, often from the shadows, never interrupting. Sometimes he would ask a quiet question. What color is a chestnut? What does laughter feel like? They were the questions of a man trying to remember a dream. She would answer as best she could, describing the rich, warm brown of the nut, the way laughter was like a sudden burst of warmth in your chest that spilled out of your mouth. One evening, he found her in the library, poring over a massive, leather-bound book she had pulled from a high shelf. The script was archaic, but some of the words were close enough to her own tongue that she could puzzle them out. "What have you found?" he asked, his voice directly behind her, making her jump. "A history, I think," she said, her heart still racing. "Of this castle. Of your line." She pointed to a passage. "It speaks of the curse. It says it was bound to the king's heart, and can only be undone when the heart of winter learns the warmth of a selfless gift." Valerus read the passage over her shoulder, his proximity sending a strange, cold shiver through her that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "Prophesies," he said, his voice laced with a weary cynicism. "The last resort of the hopeful and the desperate. I have read those words 1,000 times. They are meaningless. Are they? She challenged, looking up at him. His face was so close she could see the faint, silvery trace of a scar near his temple. A gift is not just an object. It's an act. It's giving something of yourself, with no expectation of reward. It's the opposite of the selfishness that earned you this curse, isn't it? His grey eyes narrowed. He looked from the book to her, and a new, complicated emotion entered his gaze. It was not anger. It was a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. She was not just trying to warm his castle. She was trying to heal him. The realization seemed to shake him, to breach a defense he had not known was under attack. He took a step back, retreating from her and the light of her lantern, the shadows swallowing him once more. The solstice is in 4 days, he said, his voice once more distant and cold. Your time is running out. The king's retreat was a new kind of wall. Before, he had been a passive, observing presence. Now, he was actively absent. For 2 days, she did not see him at all. The castle felt emptier than ever, the silence more profound. Her small pockets of light and warmth seemed to shrink, their defiance faltering without his presence to push against. The hope that had begun to flutter in her chest grew heavy, its wings damp. She had overstepped. She had spoken of his heart, of his selfishness, and had driven him away. She redoubled her efforts, a frantic energy seizing her. She worked from the moment she woke until she collapsed from exhaustion, her actions a prayer against the encroaching despair. She decorated the frozen conservatory with chains of folded paper stars. She polished every dusty pane of glass in the library until the grey light outside was as bright as it could possibly be. She kept the fire in the kitchen hearth roaring, the scent of baking apples a constant, lonely perfume. It all felt hollow. The spirit of the solstice was not about decoration, it was about communion. And she was utterly alone. On the 3rd day, the day before the solstice, she knew her current path was one of failure. Fighting the cold with light and scent was like trying to fill the ocean with a teaspoon. The prophecy echoed in her mind, a selfless gift. She had been trying to give him warmth, but perhaps the gift he needed was something else entirely. Perhaps he needed to be reminded not of what he had lost, but of what he still possessed, a kingdom, a history, a duty. An idea took root, audacious and terrifying. The solstice was meant to be a celebration, a gathering. This castle had not known one in 500 years. She would not just create a pocket of warmth. She would create a moment of life. She would prepare a solstice feast. The castle kitchens were a treasure trove of forgotten things. In the deep, cold pantries, she found sacks of petrified flour, casks of wine turned to vinegar, and spices that had long ago lost their scent. But in the deepest cellar, buried beneath crates of moldering tapestries, she found things that time could not touch so easily. Jars of honey, crystallized but still sweet. Sacks of dried beans and hardy root vegetables that had become like stones. And, miraculously, a small cache of preserved winter fruits, their sweetness concentrated by the ages. It would not be a grand feast, but it would be something. For the next 24 hours, she worked with a feverish intensity. She soaked the beans, simmered the tough vegetables for hours until they softened, and melted the honey to glaze the preserved fruits. She baked a dense, heavy bread from the ancient flour, a poor substitute for the real thing, but it was bread nonetheless. The kitchen, for the first time in centuries, was filled with the sounds and smells of creation. Steam fogged the cold windows. The scent of baking bread, of simmering herbs, of sweet, heated honey, pushed back against the dusty chill. She set a single table in the small, firelit dining hall adjacent to the kitchen. She used the best plates she could find, polished until the faded gold inlay gleamed. She placed her brightest, star-shaped lantern in the center. It wasn't a feast for a king. It was a meal for a lonely man. When it was done, she felt a profound sense of trepidation. She had created this defiant bubble of life, but would he even come? She had not seen him. She had no way to summon him. All she could do was wait. She sat at the table, the steam from the simple stew rising before her, and waited for the king in the encroaching silence. An hour passed. Then another. The food began to cool. The flame in her lantern began to dip. The hope in her heart, so carefully nurtured, began to gutter with it. He was not coming. She had failed. Her audacious gesture had been met with the same profound indifference as everything else. A single tear traced a path through the flower dust on her cheek. It was for Finn. For her village. And it was, to her surprise, for the lonely king in his grey prison. She had wanted to save him, and she had only succeeded in highlighting the depths of his isolation. She was about to blow out the lantern when a shadow detached itself from the doorway. Valerus stood there, his expression unreadable, his grey eyes fixed on the table. He looked at the steaming bowl, the loaf of bread, the single, glowing lantern. He took a slow, hesitant step into the room, then another. He was drawn not by a grand display, but by the simple, humble offering of a shared meal. He stopped at the other side of the table, his gaze sweeping over her creation. He did not speak. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Ilara held her breath. "What is this?" he finally asked, his voice a low rasp. "It's Solstice Eve," she said softly. "It's a tradition. To share a meal. To not be alone on the longest night." He looked at her, and the mask of perfect control seemed to crack, just for a moment. She saw a flicker of something ancient and raw in his eyes, a longing so deep it was terrifying. He was afraid. Not of her, not of the light, but of the hope this simple table represented. Hope was a more dangerous thing than despair. Despair was a familiar state. Hope could break you. He slowly, stiffly, sat in the chair opposite her. He did not reach for the food. He simply stared at the flame of the lantern, as if it were the first fire he had ever seen. The warmth from the hearth and the lantern and the food created a small pocket in the universe, a fragile truce against the eternal winter. And for the first time, the king had chosen to sit within it. The meal was eaten in a profound silence, yet it was not the empty, oppressive silence of the castle. This was a different quiet, one filled with the small sounds of life, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the soft tear of bread, the gentle crackle of the fire in the hearth. Ilara ate, though her appetite was gone, her stomach a tight knot of anticipation. Valerus did not eat. He merely sat, his long, pale fingers resting on the table's edge, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his bowl of stew. It was as if he were trying to absorb its warmth through sight alone. He watched her, his grey eyes tracking her every movement. He watched her lift the spoon to her lips, watched her break a piece of bread, watched her breathe. It was an unnerving, intense scrutiny, but it lacked his usual cold detachment. It felt searching. As if he were trying to understand the simple, mundane mechanics of being alive. "In my village," Ilara said, her voice soft, breaking the quiet spell, "on Solstice Eve, we give gifts. To mark the turning of the year. To show appreciation." Valerus's eyes lifted from the bowl to her face. "I have nothing to give," he said. The statement was flat, absolute. He was a creature of emptiness, a king of nothing. "A gift isn't about possessions," she replied, echoing her own words from the library. She had anticipated this. She reached into the small pouch at her belt. Her fingers closed around the object she had spent the last 2 days carving in secret moments. It was small, made from a piece of light-colored wood she had found in a deserted workshop, a piece of ash that had somehow resisted decay. She placed it on the table between them and slid it across the polished surface. It stopped just before his hand. It was a bird. A small, simple carving of a swallow, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Its form was crude. She was a lantern maker, not a carver, but it was imbued with an unmistakable sense of motion, of freedom. Of a creature meant for the sun. He stared at it. He did not touch it. "A bird," he said, his voice a whisper. "They say swallows are the first to return in the spring," she explained. "They are a promise. That the winter will not last forever." He finally reached out, his movements slow, hesitant, as if he expected the small carving to bite him. His long, pale fingers, impossibly cold, brushed against the wood. He picked it up. It lay in his palm, a tiny, pale shape against his deathly white skin. He traced the lines of its wings with his thumb, his touch so gentle it was almost a caress. And then, something happened. A faint, golden light began to emanate from the carving, a soft pulse that grew steadily stronger. It was not the reflected light of the lantern, it was coming from within the wood, from the point where his skin made contact. The light flowed up his hand, tracing the veins in his wrist like rivers of dawn. Valerus gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. He dropped the bird as if it had burned him. But the light did not vanish. It remained on his hand, a soft, warm glow. He stared at it, his grey eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. "What is this?" he breathed. "It's a gift," Ilara whispered, her own heart hammering. "Freely given." He looked from his glowing hand to her face. And for the first time, in the soft light of the lantern and the impossible glow on his own skin, he truly saw her. He saw the smudge of soot on her cheek, the earnest hope in her wide, brown eyes, the exhaustion etched around them. He saw the flicker of fire he had noticed within her, and he understood that it was not a fire of magic or power, but of stubborn, relentless compassion. She had come here not to defeat him, but to understand him. The prophecy. The heart of winter learns the warmth of a selfless gift. It was not about receiving an object. It was about understanding the intent behind it. The warmth was not in the wood, it was in the giving. In her hope for him. In her belief that he could be more than his curse. A shudder racked his entire body. He squeezed his eyes shut, a low groan escaping his lips. It was a sound of agony, but also of release. When he opened his eyes again, the flat, endless grey was gone. A flicker of blue, faint as a watercolor wash, touched the edges of his vision. He looked at the lantern on the table, and it was not a bright smear of grey, but a dazzling, vibrant gold. He saw the deep, warm red of the apples, the earthy brown of the bread. Color. The world was flooding with color. He looked at Ilara, and it was like seeing the sun for the first time. The brown of her eyes was not one shade, but a dozen, full of flecks of gold and green. Her hair was not a dark grey mass, but a rich, deep chestnut. The faint flush on her cheeks was a delicate, living pink. She was the most vibrant, beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I can see," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of 500 years of monochrome existence. The light from his hand did not fade. It intensified, spreading through him. A warmth, a real, physical warmth, bloomed in the center of his chest, a sensation so alien and overwhelming he thought his heart might stop. It was not the cold, dead muscle that had been beating in his ribs for centuries. It was something new. Something alive. The magic of the curse, ancient and brittle, could not withstand it. It shattered. The change was not silent. A deep, resonant hum filled the castle, the sound of a spell 5 centuries old breaking apart. The frost on the windows didn't melt, it sublimated, vanishing into thin air. The oppressive, soul-crushing cold did not recede, it was annihilated, replaced by a clean, neutral air. And outside, beyond the walls of the onyx spire, a miracle was happening. The thick, permanent cloud cover that had smothered the land began to thin. It swirled and tore apart, like a dark curtain being ripped from the sky. And through the rent, for the first time in 500 years, a star shone. Then another, and another. And on the eastern horizon, a faint, pale line of light appeared. It was the color of hope. It was the color of the dawn. The sun rose. It was not a gentle arrival. It was a glorious, violent explosion of light and color. Golden rays, sharp as swords, stabbed through the dissipating gloom, striking the peaks of the onyx spire. The black stone, which had always seemed to absorb light, now reflected it, shattering it into a million dazzling pieces. The world, for so long a study in grey and black, was suddenly, painfully, brilliantly alive. Valerus stood at the high window of the great hall, his hand pressed against the now clear glass. The light streamed in, bathing him in its warmth. It did not burn him. It did not reduce him to ash. It felt like a benediction. Like a welcome home. He could feel its heat on his pale skin, a sensation so new and overwhelming that it brought tears to his eyes. He had forgotten he could still weep. The snow-covered landscape below was no longer a dead, white canvas. It was a masterpiece of shifting hues. The shadows of the mountains were a deep, vibrant blue. The snow itself sparkled with a million points of diamond light. The skeletal trees cast long, sharp patterns on the ground. Everything was crisp, defined, breathtakingly real. Ilara stood a few feet behind him, giving him space. She watched as he took it all in, his body trembling with the force of the sensory onslaught. This was her victory. This was the son she had promised Finn. A fierce, protective joy swelled in her chest, so powerful it almost lifted her from her feet. He turned from the window, his face transformed. The harsh, remote beauty was still there, but it was softened, humanized. The stark grey of his eyes had resolved into a clear, startling silver, and they were full of a raw, unguarded emotion she could not name. Wonder. Gratitude. Awe. Ilara, he said, and his voice was different. The cold, polished stone was gone, replaced by something warmer, richer, with the timbre of real feeling. He took a step towards her, then another, his movements no longer the silent glide of a predator but the uncertain steps of a man relearning how to walk. He stopped in front of her, the morning light haloing his dark hair. He reached out, his hand no longer glowing but still radiating a faint warmth, and gently, reverently, touched her cheek. His touch was not the deathly cold she had imagined, but cool, like river stones in the shade on a summer day. It was the touch of a living thing. "You," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was you. Not the light. Not the fire. You." The intensity of his gaze was a physical force, and she felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. She had come here to strike a bargain with a monster, and she had found a man, lost and broken, and had somehow, impossibly, led him back into the light. The dynamic between them had been irrevocably altered. She was not a petitioner. He was not a cursed king. They were two people standing at the dawn of a new world. The sound of a distant bell, faint but clear, drifted up from the valley. The village, waking to a miracle. The people, who had lived their entire lives under the gloom, were seeing the sun for the first time. There would be confusion, fear, but then, there would be a joy so profound it would reshape their world. "Your village has its day of sun," Valerus said, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. His silver eyes held hers. "The bargain is fulfilled." "Yes," she whispered. But they both knew it was no longer about the bargain. What had passed between them in the dark was more binding than any contract. It was about a gift given, a soul healed, a shared dawn. The world outside had changed, but the world inside the onyx spire had changed even more. The silence was gone, replaced by the whisper of the morning wind and the frantic, hopeful beating of two hearts. The question of what now hung in the air, as bright and vast as the new blue sky. He was a king without a curse, a ruler who had been absent from his kingdom for half a millennium. She was a lantern maker whose singular act of hope had remade the world. Their paths had converged in the darkness, but now, in the light, they had to choose which way to walk. The days that followed the breaking of the gloom were a maelstrom of change. The sun, once a myth, was now a daily reality. The snow, ancient and impacted, began to melt with an alarming speed. Rivers that had been frozen for centuries groaned and cracked, their waters flowing once more. The world was waking up, loudly and messily. For the people in the valley, the initial shock gave way to a riotous, unbridled joy. They danced in the muddy, thawing streets, their faces turned up to the sky, their eyes squinting against a brightness they had only ever dreamed of. Children who had only known twilight now chased their own long, dark shadows in the golden afternoons. Finn, her Finn, had been carried out of their cottage on a stretcher, and the first touch of true sunlight on his face had roused him from his stupor. The physician had declared it a miracle. His cough was already easing, the color returning to his cheeks. Ilara's promise had been kept. But for Valerus, the new world was a constant, overwhelming assault. After 500 years of sensory deprivation, every sight, every sound, every sensation was amplified to a painful degree. The vibrant green of the first moss peeking through the snow was almost blinding. The sound of a bird singing outside his window was a deafening symphony. He spent most of his days in the shadier parts of the castle, learning to reacclimate to a world that had become profoundly alien to him. Ilara became his anchor. She was the one calm, familiar point in his chaotic new reality. She would sit with him in the library, the shutters drawn against the harshest light of noon, and describe the world to him, giving names to the colors and context to the sounds. She taught him how to distinguish the song of a robin from that of a sparrow. She brought him a single, perfect snowdrop, the first flower to bloom on the mountainside, and let him study its delicate white and green form. She was his guide, his interpreter for the language of life. In these quiet moments, the bond between them deepened, evolving from the fragile alliance of bargainer and cursed king into something more intimate and complex. He would ask her about the world beyond the valley, about the history she had learned, the changes of the last 500 years. He was like a man woken from a long sleep, hungry for knowledge, for connection. He, in turn, shared pieces of his own long life, stories from a time so distant it was now the stuff of legend. He spoke of courts and kings she had only read about in books, of a world lit only by fire and stars. One afternoon, as a warm Chinook wind rattled the window panes, he looked at her, his silver eyes serious. "The world has woken up, and so must its king. My people, they do not know me. They see this spire and they see only a source of fear, a monument to their suffering. I cannot rule from this mountain." "Not anymore. What will you do?" she asked. "I will go to them," he said, the decision settling on him like a mantle. "I will walk among them. I will learn their names and their needs. I must earn their trust. I must prove that the winter is truly over, not just in the sky, but in the heart of their king." It was a brave, terrifying prospect. He was a legend, a monster from a fairy tale. To reveal himself would be a profound risk. "You won't be alone," she said, the words coming out before she'd even thought them through. He looked at her, a gentle, grateful smile touching his lips. "I was hoping you would say that." Their descent from the onyx spire was a quiet affair. He was dressed not in the dark, severe robes of his solitude, but in simple, practical traveling clothes of dark wool and leather. Without the throne and the shadows, he looked less like an ancient monarch and more like a scholar or a wanderer, albeit one with an otherworldly grace and eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. The village of Stillwater received its king with a mixture of terror and awe. The elders, who had passed down the stories of his curse, fell to their knees. The children, who had no context for him but the sudden, miraculous arrival of the sun, stared with wide, curious eyes. But it was Alara, standing beside him, who bridged the gap. She was one of them. Her presence was a testament, a vouching for his character. She had gone into the monster's lair and returned not with a beast on a leash, but with a changed man. Valerus did not make proclamations or demand fealty. He walked through the muddy streets, he listened to the stories of the villagers, he asked questions. He stood by Finn's bedside, and the boy, now recovering, looked up at the legendary king with unconcealed wonder. Valerus placed a hand on the boy's head, a gesture of quiet blessing, and in that moment, the last vestiges of the monster in the people's minds began to dissolve. He was a good king. His 500 years of solitude had stripped him of arrogance and vanity, leaving behind a core of quiet contemplation and a profound understanding of suffering. He brought his ancient wisdom to their problems, helping them plan for the coming thaw, for the planting of crops in soil that had been fallow for generations. He was patient, thoughtful, and unfailingly just. Alara was always at his side. She was his counsel, his confidant, the voice of the people in his ear. She understood their fears and their hopes in a way he was still learning to. She tempered his grand, long-term visions with practical, immediate needs. They were a study in contrasts, the ancient, immortal king and the mortal, compassionate lantern maker, but their strengths complemented each other perfectly. They were two halves of a whole, ruling not by decree, but by a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared desire to heal the broken land. Their evenings were spent in Alara's small cottage, which had become the unofficial heart of the recovering kingdom. The fire in her hearth was a gathering place, and the light from her lanterns was a symbol of the new era. It was there, one night, with the scent of beeswax in the air and the sound of a spring rain tapping on the roof, that Valerus took her hand. His skin was still cool, but it was a living coolness, and her own hand was warm in his. "Alara," he began, his silver eyes serious in the flickering light. "When you came to my castle, you made a bargain for one day of sun. But you gave my kingdom back its future. You gave me back my life." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of profound, courtly respect that made her heart leap. I have spent 5 centuries in the dark, and I have no wish to spend another moment without the woman who brought me into the light. Rule with me, not just as an advisor, but as my partner. My queen. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Queen. It was a title she had never imagined, a life she had never conceived of. But looking at him, at this man she had come to know so intimately, this king she had helped to remake, she knew there was only one answer. It was not a role she was accepting, but a future she was choosing, a partnership she had already begun. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady. Yes. A year passed. The world healed with the steady, inexorable patience of nature. The first spring was a riot of green, the first summer a long, golden dream, the first autumn a blaze of fiery color. The land, so long dormant, proved astonishingly fertile. The harvest was a bounty beyond anyone's wildest imagining. The onyx spire, once a symbol of dread, was now known as the Sunstone Keep, its black walls a dramatic backdrop to a kingdom reborn. The winter returned, as all winters must, but this was a different season entirely. It was a time of crisp, clean air, of bright, sparkling snow, of cozy hearths and shared stories. It was a winter of rest, not of oppression. On the eve of the solstice, the entire kingdom gathered at the base of the spire. A great festival was underway, a celebration of the miracle that had occurred 1 year prior. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the scent of roasting food. Lanterns, crafted by villagers in the style Alara had taught them, hung from every tree and every eave, a constellation of earthbound stars. On the high balcony of the keep, Valerus and Alara stood together, looking down at the celebration. He was dressed in royal blues and silvers that mirrored the twilight sky, and she in a simple, elegant gown of deep evergreen. A simple silver circlet rested on her dark hair. She was every inch a queen, not of station, but of spirit. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. 1 year, he said, his voice full of a quiet wonder that had not faded. 1 year since you walked into my darkness and hung a single, ridiculous lantern on my gate. She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. It wasn't so ridiculous, was it? It was the most courageous, foolish, and beautiful thing I had ever witnessed, he replied, his voice soft with affection. He turned to her, his silver eyes reflecting the 1,000 lights below. You taught me that light isn't just the absence of darkness, and warmth isn't just the absence of cold. They are presence. They are connection. They are hope. He gestured to the crowd below. This is your doing. This joy. This life. It's our doing, she corrected gently. I may have opened the door, but you were the one who had the courage to walk through it. You are the one who has worked every day since to be the king these people deserve. Below them, a hush fell over the crowd as they looked up. It was time. Together, the king and queen lifted a single, large lantern, one they had crafted together. It was shaped like a sun, its rays intricate and delicate. Inside, a bright, steady flame burned. It was the ceremonial solstice lantern, the new symbol of their kingdom. A symbol of light born from darkness, of hope rekindled, of a partnership that had healed a nation. They released it into the night sky. It rose slowly, a golden star ascending, a promise sent up into the darkness. A great cheer erupted from the crowd, a wave of pure joy and gratitude that washed over the 2 figures on the balcony. Valerus wrapped his arm around Alara, pulling her close. The cool, crisp winter air surrounded them, but between them, there was only a profound and gentle warmth. They were no longer a vampire king and a human girl. They were a king and queen, a partnership forged in shadow and destined to rule in light. And as they watched their son climb into the star-filled sky, they knew that this was only the beginning. Their reign, like the seasons, would be one of balance, of change, and of the enduring, stubborn light of hope. The curse had been a thing of stillness, but their love, and their kingdom, would be a thing of life.